Hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you're able to join this presentation. It's one I feel pretty passionately about, so we're going to cram a lot into our 45 minutes or so together. For those who are new to Bright Talk, very quickly, let me point out just a couple of things. First of all, underneath the video, you're going to see a tab that says attachments. And I encourage you to jump into that tab and take all the bonus resources and next steps that we have for you there, starting with the slides, PDF of the slides from this presentation. And I'd also encourage you to make sure to take a look at the brand new SHRM recertification courses that we're offering over on People First Leadership Academy. On People First Leadership Academy, you can find about 60 courses, very affordable, many of them free, to help with matters related to personal effectiveness, managerial effectiveness, team and leadership development. So as we are preparing for this presentation, just one more thing I'd like to ask you to do today, and that is, if you would please, to leave me a review and some comments at the end of the presentation so that I've got a feel for what you liked, what you'd like to see done differently, and anything else that you can offer me. Just always looking to give you the kind of content and delivery that you're looking for. I'm Deb Calvert, and this is the People First Potential channel on Bright Talk. Here on Bright Talk, we do one-way delivery. There's not a lot of opportunity since so many of you come on demand. Not a lot of opportunity for questions, although if you're here live, I certainly welcome those. But over on People First Leadership Academy, that's peoplefirstpotential.com, that's where we have a lot of highly interactive, really fun sorts of workshops. And I'd encourage you to jump in and take a look at those, as well as looking back over all the presentations here in the archives on Bright Talk. Now, this topic, as I said, it's one I feel pretty passionately about. Talent review, the 9-box model. Once upon a time, before I opened up my own business about 18 years ago, I was a director with a Fortune 500 company. And in that role, I participated in the talent review process, which included rankings of the division VPs in all 31 markets. So my input, along with just 6 other people in our ivory tower office there at corporate, we determined which senior executives in those 31 markets were viewed most favorably, put on the fast track to next level positions. It affected how they were paid and perceived. So I have to tell you, those impressions that we offered, they had the power to override facts and figures. And the impact of our mostly unfounded opinions lasted far longer than whatever it is that formed those impressions in the first place. Let me give you an example. We were reviewing those division VPs across the 31 markets, and a colleague offered up one of the usual contenders to be ranked number 1 in those annual rankings. And I asked why, because The numbers that I had reviewed coming into the meeting, the numbers just didn't add up to stellar performance. In fact, year over year, the revenue had dipped considerably. And my colleague blamed a natural disaster that had hit that area for the decline in revenue. So I pressed a little harder because I pointed out that the share of market had also dipped dramatically. And presumably, any other competitors in that same marketplace would have been affected in similar ways by that natural disaster, right? That act of God shouldn't have targeted just our own company and not the competitors. And I learned very quickly that I was accurate in my fervor for fairness, but I was really pretty naive about how things like this work out. And it was in that conversation that I first learned that talent review isn't a review so much as it's a license to show favoritism and to subjectively champion a few. Otherwise, that process would be one of very straightforward metrics review. It wouldn't require as much human debate. And that's my main objection to this entire process. But I have other issues with it too, and we'll get to those. Before we talk about those, we should probably step back just for a moment and take a look at the 9-box model, the traditional model, and maybe talk about its history, its purpose that it serves. And I should say this, I have no intention of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We'll also talk about what's good about this process and how we can just improve it so that we get the best of both worlds, objectivity and fairness, alongside a reasonable talent review process that can help you in your organization. So what you are seeing now on screen, this is the 9-box talent review approach. It was first developed by McKinsey for GE back in 1970, over 50 years ago. And this simple model, it maps two variables for employees. The first is employee performance. Ideally, that one really should be as objective and quantifiable as humanly possible. Sadly, though, not all organizations use data to assess performance, and they do allow this to become a subjective assessment. Now, looking across the horizontal axis, you see medium and low and high performance. Low is over there on the left-hand side, high is on the right-hand side, medium's across the middle. And then you can see the second variable, that is potential. Herein lies one of the very biggest problems. Assessing anyone else's potential is purely subjective. We'll come back to that shortly, but it's a very important point that I want to underscore. Now, on this model, potential is represented on the vertical axis with low potential at the bottom, high potential at the top. And when you put the two variables together and you choose high, medium, or low for each of them, you end up with 9 combinations, 9 categories for employees. Now, the purpose of the 9-box model, it has some substance to it. It has some validity and some goodness within it. So the purpose of the 9-box model is really to represent visually what talent review could look like. And it's to provide a framework so that you can facilitate these conversations about talent and succession management and make some effort to similarly evaluate people. That's the purpose. And this really has been widely used in determining how to allocate budget for employee development. For example, putting high performance, high potential employees into leadership development programs, trying to prepare them for next level roles and trying to identify any candidates that might be ready now. The 9-box model, it's used to determine who's promotable, who's fast-tracked, and in some organizations, annual raises and bonuses are also informed by this process. And though it's not a stated purpose, if you've worked with one of these at all, you know that halos and horns do get attached to employees in certain boxes. The high potential, high performance employees, hyper, they get attention from senior leaders and they get opportunities that aren't otherwise available to anyone. The low per employees, right? They're largely ignored or they're micromanaged. And in some cases, people categorized here are automatically placed on performance plans or they're terminated. Jack Welch back at GE, he had the 20-70-10 rule, and it was born straight out of this model. He allowed only 20% to be categorized in the top boxes. 70% went in the middle boxes, 10% had to be put into the bottom boxes. And then many other organizations adopted something similar, forced rankings, which, of course, are problematic. There's been litigation about stack ranking systems. They found to be subjective, arbitrary, allowing for discrimination. So that's why Ford and Microsoft and Accenture and lots of others have dumped those kinds of ranking systems. Separate from that, right? You've got hyper, low per. Mainly when people know about these conversations and they know that people are being bucketed, mostly people are just popo. They feel passed over and pissed off. People feel either tapped or capped by this process. Either way, they feel disenfranchised. And if you could only put 20% of employees in your top boxes, that means that you're providing something less to 80% of your workforce. They're getting less opportunity, less esteem, less support, less ennoblement, and there's absolutely no way around that perception, even if your process is secretive. So here we are. We're in this era of the great resignation. We've got record lows in employee engagement. At a time like this, can you really afford to disenfranchise 80% of your employees? Wouldn't it make more sense to create more development opportunities, more support, and more ways to create a sense of belonging and a belief in the organization? Because the organization demonstrates that they genuinely believe in every employee. If you want more from employees, you've got to be sure that they're emotionally connected to your organization. And subjective processes that take something away from employees, well, that's just a recipe for creating emotional disconnect. And what about that vicious circle that you may inadvertently be creating? Right? People already feel burned out by stressful workloads and short staffing. And then, despite their best efforts, they aren't seen as having a high level of potential or they aren't performing at the top. So now they get dinged in the talent review process. Now they're boxed into a career limiting category. And for them, it feels utterly unfair due to the circumstances that they were thrust into. So now their burnout mounts. They demonstrate even less emotional connection. They exert less discretionary effort. And you're probably saying, well, you see there, I put them in the right box. They aren't high performance, high potential. When it was the circumstances, not the individual, that caused that to happen. I think a lot of times the ways that we perceive employees aren't really the sole responsibility of the employee. Now, I promised I'd come back to this point. I feel pretty strongly about this. Making any judgment about someone's potential, well, it's inherently subjective. Potential, that's something that's latent. It's not actual at this time. It's about what's possible. How could anyone absolutely determine somebody else's potential? Most people don't even understand their own potential. And frankly, I prefer to believe that every single person has some measure of potential, something latent that's just waiting for the right time, the right opportunity, the right catalyst to bring out that potential. AMA had a study which was really quite interesting. It's their enterprise study called Identifying and Developing High Potential Talent. Here are some of the findings. The majority of respondents, 74%, said that high potentials are identified based on performance appraisals and senior management recommendations. Now, only 41.6% said that they weigh innovative and or unique contributions to the business when they evaluate potential. About a third said that their companies use either or both talent assessments. 35% said that. Peer input, 34% said that. But only 17.5% reported educational background as a metric for evaluating potential. Oh, and here's a side note. These most used criteria, they don't include demonstration of company values, willingness to take stretch assignments, learning agility, leadership qualities, or other criteria that really ought to count for something if what we're talking about is potential. In other words, the subjective opinion of one or just a few people matters most. And in more places than you might suspect, it matters more than anything that would truly be a measure of potential in whether or not an employee is designated high potential, medium potential, or low potential. In most organizations, there's a big void, right? There's no criteria for defining potential. Nobody gives you a list and says, hey, look at these things when you objectively evaluate potential. And then discussions about potential, they blatantly demonstrate subjectivity and unconscious bias. I've witnessed a lot of these conversations in a lot of companies. And although it may be a blind spot, this is almost always the case for the people who are involved in these talent review meetings. And one of the reasons that's a blind spot is because the role of unconscious bias isn't directly addressed or considered. Now, unconscious bias, it's something that we've all got. No way around it. It's unavoidable. Unconscious bias in a talent review process is welcome in. We're assessing people's potential, and that invites subjectivity. And by opening the door to subjectivity, you're also inviting unconscious biases to run rampant. Let me show you just how 5 of them come into play during talent review processes that incorporate that 9-box talent review model that I've been showing you. All right, so the first one is familiarity bias. Right? The better known any individual is, the more favorable the ratings are likely to be. Being visible, outgoing, well-connected, that's not a true measure of potential, only of political savvy. And then there's the affinity bias. Remember, these are all unconscious biases. They're not deliberate. They are real, though, and they can't be ignored. The affinity bias says that the more someone reminds you of yourself, the more favorable your ratings are likely to be. When you see yourself in someone else, you overlook flaws. You give grace that's not earned or deserved. And similarly, the less someone is like you, the less likely you are to see positives and potential in them. It's because you're not looking through a fair lens, not because that potential is lacking. And this affinity bias, it applies to all sorts of things: personality style, background, education, where you're from, mannerisms. Certainly may apply to race and other sorts of things that are more obvious, but we've got to be hyper aware of it and not let it interfere. Now, remember, we saw just earlier on the previous slide that nearly 69% rely heavily on the opinions of senior managers when evaluating potential. Now, listen to this quote. Comes from SHRM research that explains why there's a problem because of affinity bias. And the quote from SHRM, it's from their article called Selection Criteria for High Potentials Varies Widely. Um, the quote is, senior executives, managers, directors, and HR and training and development functions need to be on the same page when it comes to participants' selection criteria, or there's a significant risk that senior leaders will tap only those rising stars that mirror themselves. And that's not a knock against senior leaders. This is true for all of us. Affinity bias is something that we've got to recognize and understand is an inherent flaw in this process. Proximity bias, well, this one's increasingly evident in work from home and in remote work locations. It's a subset of familiarity bias. Naturally, you're more likely to become comfortable with someone that you see all day, every day, versus someone you only see briefly a few times a week on Teams or Zoom. Keep in mind that being near to you does not translate into true potential. We have conformity bias, right? This is a process flaw. Peer pressure to conform to group opinions does result in some managers inadequately defending the potential of their own employees, or of doing a poor job of describing those employees' potential in a way that others can understand it. Flashback to that meeting I described to you at the opening of this presentation, and there was definitely conformity bias in operation. I was fairly new to that group, and the others in that group had consistently rated this particular VP at or near the top for many years. The pressure for me to conform so we could just move on was great. And I'm a little ashamed to admit that I fell right into it. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I was demonstrating conformity bias. And then there's overconfidence bias. This one, it's also a process flaw. Once you bucket a person in a certain box, that label sticks. And the reason the label sticks is because any group, when they come to a conclusion, they tend to believe we all agreed it was a group decision, therefore it must be accurate. And there's an overconfidence in the initial assessment. Group agreement in any scenario can lead to this generalized overconfidence in decisions that were made together. Subconsciously, members of that group are thinking, well, we all agreed, so it must be the right decision. And that's why labels in talent review, once they're given, they really do stick. They're difficult to change. Now, people understand that they have unconscious biases. We may sort of deny that. We might duck conversations about those because it's so uncomfortable. But people who participate in talent review processes where unconscious biases run rampant, they usually do have a vague sense of discomfort. At some level, they realize that decisions being made are flimsy and that they're fraught with subjectivity and bias. Maybe that's why there's usually some discomfort about whether or not this process should be transparent. Some people will advocate for full transparency in their talent review process, right? By sharing information, they believe they're setting up healthy competition. Others opt for it to be secretive or partly secretive in the approach. And they're doing that because, well, they don't want to have pushback. They don't want to have situations where there's been misunderstanding and where people aren't going along with whatever it was that was decided. But both are problematic. If it's highly secretive, Please know that it's not. However many people you have sitting around the table, that's how many people might share a little information, a little tidbit with someone. And then you know what happens. People make stuff up, they fill in the gaps, and it runs across the organization. And just knowing that there's something secret can really bother people. If it's transparent, well, you have pushback for another reason. People don't agree. They don't believe it was fair. They didn't have a chance to have any input in the process, and they understand that there's something that isn't quite right with whatever it is that's going on here. So let's jump back then and talk about a better way of doing things. We'll use our remaining time on trying to figure out how we can get better at this. And it really starts with replacing potential in the 9-box grid. So I'm going to start even simpler. I'm going to give you a 4-box model to sort of explain the concept. And then we'll build on this to be able to talk about how to get a 9-box model that looks different, is more objective, and is certainly much easier for people to receive and participate in. So the first thing that we should do is take a look at a different construct of thinking, represented in this very simple way. In your organization, in just about any role, there are results that are required. This is the performance metric. And whatever the role might be, there are deliverables associated with that job. There are key performance indicators. Call them whatever you will. There are an amount of work, output, quality of work that you're considering. And you can set objective measures for just about any job related to that output volume or that quality of work, whatever it is that you measure. We're calling that results. It's on the horizontal grid here. And you have two options. It's either the right results, that's the RR in the right-hand side boxes, or it's the wrong results. You're either getting results or you're not getting results. And we can look at that objectively. There should be absolutely nothing here that's subjective. The results are predefined in the job description before any person is in that role. And then we're not making excuses. We're not making exceptions. You either are or you are not getting the right results. WR on the left-hand side, those two boxes, those are wrong results. And so it's just either or, wrong results or right results in this very simplest form. But now our vertical axis, we're going to replace potential because it's not reasonable to evaluate other people's potential. It's not fair. It's not legitimate. But there's something else that we can measure objectively, and that is, how do people go about doing their work? And we can get right results as well as right way. That's the upper right-hand box. That's ideal. That's what we're looking for, that people do the work. They interact with each other. They abide by the values of the organization. They represent your company well. The way they conduct themselves would be the right way. And that's what everybody ought to be aiming for, the right results, the right way. The right way is in the upper two boxes. I talked about the right-hand side box. Let's talk about the upper right box. Here's when somebody is getting the wrong results, WR, but they are conducting themselves in the right way. They're making the effort. They're behaving professionally. They're taking measures to learn and to grow. They're coachable and open. You'd probably consider that person differently than you would the one in the lower left box, the polar opposite, now getting the wrong results, but doing things the wrong way. These are the folks who probably need to either change immediately or be changed out of the organization. Because if they're doing things the wrong way, wreaking havoc across your organization, and they're not even getting results, why would you keep someone like that on your team? Last but not least, lower right-hand box, someone who's getting the right results, but doing things the wrong way. There seem to be a lot of these folks in organizations recently because we're so afraid to let people go. So it's a proficient technical expert, but they're extremely negative, toxic. They are causing other people to leave the organization because it becomes so intolerable. Or it's the salesperson who's meeting quota, but having a lot of write offs a few months later and a great deal of customer dissatisfaction, and maybe even some accusations of not doing business with a high degree of integrity. But the sales manager says, yes, but they're driving the numbers. We need to keep them because the numbers are there. We probably ought to talk more often in organizations about what it looks like to do business the right way in this team, in this organization. This is the gap. Instead of measuring people potential, let's measure how people conduct themselves, how they go about doing their work, how aligned they are with our values. And we can do that objectively by putting it in terms of behaviors and something that's quantifiable. So just to recap, the what, that's the quantity and the quality of work. You've got all sorts of ways that you probably already look at this, and you should keep it as objective as it possibly can be. If it's not objective, maybe it doesn't belong in the standards. And then we're looking at how. If you've got corporate values, you put some behaviors around those. You give examples. If you have professional standards, you make it very clear. This is what's acceptable. This is what's not acceptable. This is what's exemplary. And everything is behavioral so that it's measurable and easy to understand, and we're stripping out subjectivity. And what we can do now is that we can get some objective criteria in both of those dimensions. No more guesswork, no more favoritism, no more perceptions of someone having those horns or that halo. And when we get to this with objective measures all the way around, we can create a new 9-box model. Now we have what we used to is still on the horizontal axes. That's our performance, our results. You still have high, you still have medium, and you still have low performance. But then what's on the vertical axis is different. It's no longer potential. It's no longer subjective. Now we're mapping how the work gets done, how people interact with each other. This is coming straight out of your ethics or your values or your performance standards that you have set up objectively. And here again, we have low, medium, and high going up the vertical axis. And we're mapping now 9 boxes together to factor in that medium. And you come up with 9 combinations. For example, in the upper right-hand corner, this is high performance, and it's also high in terms of how the work is done. So it's how what, and it's how high. High how. High what, high how in this upper right-hand box. You would agree that's your consistent superstar. That is how you would like to see everyone develop and aspire to work. You've got someone who is operating at a high level in how they do the work, but they're not quite there with the results yet. They're medium in their results. Well, that's certainly one to watch. People who are doing work the way we want it to be done are people we ought to invest in, people we ought to believe in, people we ought to support and coach so that they can improve their results. The other green box, that's medium in both areas. That is, that is medium in the how, but it's high in the what. So this is still a solid performer. There's a little work to be done here on the way they interact with others, that professionalism that they display, the way that they demonstrate our values and our ethics. But since it's not low, and since those results are there, again, this is someone that we probably really ought to work with. The yellow boxes, there are question marks in those yellow boxes. You'll have to spend a little time, do a little coaching and development, see what's going on that might give you an opportunity to help people who have those combinations. And the red boxes, these are performance improvement plans, serious discussions, retraining. Something has to go differently here because you can't indulge employing these people forever, but you also can't subjectively abandon them. That's why it's so important that we get to objective criteria Objective tells us what to do. Objective behaviorally shows us what needs to change so that people can make those choices. Those scenarios, right, they are giving you a way to talk to people, not just about people, because you would have objective measures and you'd have behavioral examples, and you'd be able to, in these green boxes, call that out for others to see. Celebrate this. Give people a chance to understand what it looks like, what you're looking for when people are successful in your organization. And those medium boxes, the ones in yellow, well, here you'd still have the objective measures and you'd have the behavioral examples. So when you're asking these questions, you're not asking them about people, you're posing these questions to people. You're giving them an opportunity to see a contrast between where they are, where they could be, and what they have to do differently to make that adjustment. And again, in the lower third boxes, the very same thing. If you're talking about people, it's about the performance improvement plan or something else that had to get escalated. But even before that, I hope you're talking to people to help them understand the impact, to help them understand what's going on and what needs to be different, why there's not a very strong, good fit here. Now, what I'm going to show you on screen next, it's going to have some really small type. But let me just show it to you here briefly. This is a sample grid. This is for an actual organization that has taken the time to develop performance standards, job descriptions that clearly indicate what those results are, as well as how the work is to be done. They've built competencies for every single job across their entire organization. There is a ton of clarity, including behavioral examples. And it's a very, very transparent process that's designed to support people. The comparisons are always to the descriptions in these boxes, not person to person. That gets subjective really quick. But it's to what's described in the box. And since it's so small, let me read just one to you. The middle box, the one that's labeled motivation lacking. This is described as inconsistent in adhering to professional standards and/or ethics, values, competency. Is inconsistent in delivering expected quality and/or quantity of work. Skill has been demonstrated, so address problem of will, their willingness to do the work. Discuss candidly and coach for consistent performance in work tasks and in how work is done. So in addition to providing an example for the individual, the other thing that's going on here is that there is a remedy prescribed to the manager so that it can be consistent and fair each time someone is stacking up in this way when it comes to how the work is done and what work is done. Now, I mentioned that this organization, they built out competencies to make it so clear. And here at People First Productivity Solutions, we helped them. We support this kind of work in our client engagements that we have. But we started from absolute scratch in this organization, and the management team, as well as the frontline supervisors, participated in creating these tools. They had a high degree of buy-in, and they have transformed the organization substantially because of the processes that they went through over the past year. Now, one of the competencies that they chose is communication. So they've defined what that competency is, and then they've given acceptable, unacceptable, and exemplary behavioral examples. In the stay interviews, in the performance appraisals, whatever tools you might be using, this is what the discussion is based on. People evaluate themselves based on what their own behaviors are, the ones that are consistently demonstrated, and that's where the conversations start. In this organization, as I said, they also rewrote all their job descriptions. They made sure those expectations were absolutely clear, and it included daily deliverables in addition to other pieces of the job description, so that there could be no question about what it looked like day to day to be doing the right work getting those right results and doing it the right way. And we did set up professional standards for them because they had some issues of a lot of gossip and negativity, unprofessionalism. And so we needed to give them something to create that contrast. They ended up with 10 professional standards. And one of them, the one you see here, is I do what I say I will do. I follow through on my promises and commitments. What's defined unprofessionally is what they no longer want to see or will accept. What's defined as professional behavior, again, behaviorally, objectively, creates that standard for how we're going to do our work. The right way is defined in the professional behavior that you see there at the bottom. And this was true for all 10 of their professional standards that they created. Now, here at People First Productivity Solutions, this is the kind of work that we do. We work with organizations, we provide tools and resources like what you'll see over there on peoplefirstpotential.com. That's People First Leadership Academy. I hope we get a chance to take a look there at all the different free and low cost sorts of options that we offer. All of them are highly interactive. What I want to show you here is just one last thing. This is brand new on People First Leadership Academy. In the SHRM Basque competencies, there's one that's called out that's about leadership and navigation. And so we have created a series of 10 workshops that all pertain specifically to that particular competency. We're going to be offering them in a series that begins in the fall of 2023. And these will be highly interactive workshops. Every single one of them is worth 1.5 continuing education credits for SHRM recertification. So I hope you'll check this out. I'll leave that displayed there on screen for you for just a moment so you can find your way over to it. You can take the whole series as well, and that would be 15 SHRM recertification credits. Please don't forget to take the attachments. There's more information about this course as well as about anything else that you might like to take a look at, but there are some bonus resources as well. And as you're leaving the presentation today, don't forget to leave us a review. We always really appreciate those insights that you give us. I'm Deb Calvert, and I appreciate you taking time to reconsider how you do talent review and to construct a model that isn't subjective, that isn't problematic, but that's fair and that really helps people to do better and be evaluated fairly.